All right, so I just wanted to do somewhat of a video explanation of this entire lesson. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because there's a lot of things here that may be really easy just to forget. So I just want to have kind of a video reference so that I can watch it. So we started off with seeing how to grab the prototype property on the constructor functions. And this allowed us to path methods to it. And if we go under this code, we basically just asked, how can we just add stuff to the constructor functions that made an object and have it added to our constructor function? So this is basically just saying, how do we add functions or methods to all of our object instances that are created by our constructor functions? So in this example here, I'll explain. So in this first classes, it's basically saying, how are we passing this prototype function to every single object that this constructor function of students is creating? And the process is actually called prototypical inheritance. So it sounds fancy, but prototypical inheritance basically means that every object that is created by our constructor function will take all of its information from the constructor function itself. So if we add a function or a method into the constructor function, that means that it'll affect everything or all of the objects created by that constructor function, because we're changing the global scope of the constructor function itself. So it sounds confusing, but all that basically means is that every prototype function that is added to our constructor function is going to affect every object that comes out of this constructor function, because every object that comes out of this constructor function is basically taking all of the code and just creating a new object or a new instance. And that affects it because it's coming from here, from the global student. So next we were finding the get property of, or get prototype of, and we found out that the object, meaning this symbol right here, just the global object that belongs to JavaScript, actually has a prototype. And from that prototype is where all of our methods, all of our properties, and even other objects, that's where it all comes from. So moving on from here, we went over that. Object.getPrototype of. We were basically asked next, based off of what we know about constructor functions, what happens if we use the object's constructor function? So what happens if we use function and then object, right? And what I said would happen, or what I thought would happen, is that it would just create a regular object. And this is true, it just creates a regular object. But something to note here is that by using this object, we're actually changing the language itself. So by changing the object itself, like the global object, we're changing everything that comes after it. So like all of our methods, all of our other objects, and all of our properties now don't work. So that's why this page of code didn't work. So when we tried to create a student out of the constructor function of students, and then we tried to find the prototype of it and equal it to the global object, it didn't work because we changed the language itself. So moving on from here, we went over finding the prototype, so I'll explain that. So finding the prototype is pretty simple, and we use this fancy word that's called the dunder proto. And all that basically means is this little line of code right here. This is the Dunder proto. And this is basically going one scope above the student one into the student. So the Dunder proto is basically finding what the parent element of this constructor or this instance of the constructor is. And this equals student prototype because this is true. If we go up one scope from student one, it'll just equal the student. And that means this second statement is also true, because if we start at student one and we go one scope up into student, and then we chain another proto, so we go one scope up into the global object, it does equal the object prototype, because the global object and the object prototype are actually the same exact thing. And that's that. So that's going over that. That's going over that. So basically what I really just wanted to explain is that the object prototype is kind of like a chain. So it moves up, up, up the chain, and the beginning of the chain or the end of the chain is actually the global object, because that is where everything comes from. And that is why when we change the global object, none of our code will actually work, or in other words, will get false. So what this is saying is that student one is equal to student. That's true. But if we go up over student into the global object, that's false. And the reason why this is false is because we've actually changed the language itself with this line of code. So I explained that earlier, but that is something that you need to remember. And you also need to remember that the prototype is just a chain leading up to the global object in which all methods, all objects, and all properties come from.